University of Geneva and teaches during the summer at the Catholic Theological Institute in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. He is presenting on principled centrism in an unprincipled age. And so we have Ryan Miller. We were told he was having some electricity trouble, so I hope that he can log in.
I'm right here.
Okay, excellent. You're with us. So please begin when ready. Can you turn on your camera, or are you going to be just...
Oh, is it? I just hit share the screen. Is that not showing?
You're good.
Okay.
Excellent.
Great. All right. Okay. So first of all, just a little warning that there are a few comments and quotations in here that are pretty offensive. I just think sometimes it's important to kind of stare bias in the face, but you know, be aware that I obviously don't endorse the content of the things that I'm criticizing as biases. So, all right. So what I'm concerned with is the question about how we can be centrists, especially in an age that doesn't seem to lend itself to it. So first I'll cover why I think we want to be centrists, but why that's hard. Then something about why that's hard in a more philosophical frame, and then where we can go from there. All right. Oh, why did that? Sorry. There we go. All right. So the first part I'm going to go through pretty quickly, because I think most of us probably agree that our political culture is not so great right now. But first, a bit of review. So I think decision making is always going to require authenticity. That's pretty clear in Lonergan, whether it's an insight where he calls it genuineness, or later on where he adopts the term authenticity. That we can't make good decisions without having an attitude in which performance matches aspiration, and that having that kind of attitude really requires a whole kind of openness to the universe of being, and that in turn requires freedom from bias. So in order to make good decisions, we need to not brush questions aside, not smother doubts, not push problems down, not be escapist. Instead, we have to confront issues, inspect them, work out all the implications, including on our own lives. And I suggest that that kind of authenticity is kind of always already political. So first, because we exist within traditions. So if we take the tradition as it exists for our standard, then our best attempts to be authentic are just going to be a realization of unauthenticity. This is what Lonergan means by the idea of minor and major authenticity. And so insofar as our traditions are themselves political traditions, they're traditions that are worked out in a community with other people, then our own authenticity, our own decision making is going to rely on our ability to work out major authenticity in our political traditions. And then I think you can even see that kind of parallelism in the way Lonergan discusses the matter, because even in Insight, when he's just talking about kind of individual authenticity or genuineness, he still refers already to the idea that there's a certain conservative force that encourages us to maintain our routines, and then there's a kind of a force that's pushing us to change our routines. And so we can already see a kind of parallel in that discussion of minor authenticity with the discussion of major authenticity in our political traditions. And then I want to suggest that the problem for us, the problem of political authenticity for us, is pretty acute. So these are just kind of a grab bag of quotations from the section on bias and insight. But what struck me to include them was the way that they kind of read so immediately onto our own age. That bias generates successful as well as unsuccessful classes. And those who are unsuccessful can be militant in one way, but then in the other direction, there are the reactionaries that want to preserve their success. He means here a kind of worldly success, and that can lead to violence. Surely we see that on the news every day now. That only under the rubric of common sense, we end up with a kind of incompetent guide. We constantly have disasters that no one expects, you know, those 2020 bingo memes. And then we end up with a kind of cumulative regression. So there are conflicts in society that seem like they shouldn't be necessary, but they're happening anyway. Some parts of society that we think are valuable kind of are atrophying, constant, you know, bowling alone kind of idea. Others grow like tumors, you know, the various, you know, I saw the other day on the news that there are like 129 different SWAT teams in the federal government or something like that. It's just every agency has to have its own kind of militarized police, things like that. And so the only intelligibility becomes a kind of equilibrium of power in this kind of age that's been subject to bias. And we don't have political authenticity. And that leads to a kind of helplessness to provide really coherent solutions. We end up with a kind of totalitarian view. So every kind of intellectual independence is just a kind of non-conscious myth. You have to choose sides. And the means of making people choose sides includes every technique of indoctrination, propaganda, every kind of pressure tactic, all kinds of blackmail, and then even the official means, the terrorism of political police, of prisons and torture, of concentration camps, of transported or extirpated minorities. You know, Lonergan seems to have a pulse on our own times here. All right, so in the midst of all that mess that we need to sort out if we're going to make good decisions, why should we be centrists? Well, first, Lonergan himself has a kind of built-in opposition to extremism, right? He says that, you know, one bias is not fixed by the equal and opposite bias. Rather, somehow you have to come up with some other solution. So you can't just run to the other extreme when you see the evils of one extreme. And then in the tradition of Catholic social teaching, we see that historically there's been an objection to both a kind of strong socialism and also to a kind of unfettered capitalism, with a historical sense of a sort of centrist vision of some kind there. And then there's this often repeated quotation of Lonergan that's quite explicitly centrist, right? He says there's going to be a solid right, but they're just determined to live in a world that no longer exists. There's going to be a scattered left that's just powered by fads. And so what should we do? We should be centrists. But I want to suggest that that kind of centrism can be too facile if we're not careful. So first, just to look at kind of what political unity has meant in the United States. So these are just some grab bags again, but you see that some pretty bad things have been really popular, immense bipartisan support. If Jen Sanders were here, she could give us, you know, a lecture on Lonergan's view of the Farm Bill, and you would see why that's right up there with the Patriot Act or the War on Terror in the list of bad ideas. And then other things that maybe shouldn't be so controversial, like healthcare for everybody in the way that maximally respects private enterprise and at the lowest possible cost is in fact incredibly controversial. So just being a kind of go for the bipartisan things is not really the kind of centrism we want. And then looking back a little more historically, if you remember from your middle school or high school history classes, the era of good feelings under James Monroe, this sort of era of one party rule in the United States, and James Monroe is supposed to be such a gracious character. But look, what brought this on? Was the collapse of the Federalist Party. Why did the Federalist Party collapse? Well, because they were anti-3/5 compromise and anti-war. So maybe that wasn't the greatest kind of centrist moment. And for all of the supposed graciousness of Monroe, he actually applied a kind of loyalty oath to his party in order to have any kind of appointment in government. So we don't necessarily want to just go back to the era of good feelings. And I think this is not just about politicians or political parties. This is actually about voters. So Pew did a big study a few years ago and showed that people who identify as centrists and independents and swing voters actually have more extreme positions than a lot of people who identify as extreme partisans. It's just that the extreme positions aren't all kind of lined up in the direction of one party ideology. So if you just say, do what the median voter wants, be that kind of centrist, you're going to end up with some really, really strange views. And then the thing that really sticks the most in my conscience as a problem for centrism is Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he says that he's disappointed with the white moderate. He's reached the regrettable conclusion that the great stumbling block in the striding towards Black freedom is maybe not the extreme racist, but the white moderate, more devoted to order than to justice, and who thinks that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. So I think that we have a real kind of aporia here. We have strong reasons as Catholics, as people who take Lonergan seriously, to be centrists, and yet there are real perils to a kind of mechanical centrism, and yet we need a kind of political philosophy in order to make our own decisions. We can't just kind of work things out one by one as separate issues. So that takes me to the question of diagnosis. How do we make sense of that in Lonergan's terms? And here I'm going to try to slow down just a little bit, because I think now I'm going to be on more controverted terrain. So the goal for me here is, first of all, to figure out how to really define the right and the left, what is really the essential aspect of them, and then how we can understand what unprincipled centrism is so we can avoid doing that. All right, so a first pass at defining the left. There's a libertarian economist, Brian Kaplan, who says that it's really simple. Leftists are anti-market. And we might think that's too simplistic. Obviously, it's not the friendliest description, maybe. But then, look even at the Wikipedia entry. What is the left? The left seeks social justice through redistributive social and economic policies. And obviously, if you're in a mostly capitalist country, as we are, then to seek redistribution is to say that the market has created failings that need to be redressed, that we shouldn't be content with market outcomes. And then even if we want to think beyond just economic leftism, if we look at Kimberly Crenshaw, who's the person who invented the idea of intersectionality, she says the point of intersectionality is to make room for more advocacy and remedial practices to create a more egalitarian system. But again, let's look at this word remedial practices, right? So what's the goal there? Well, to somehow there's something that's being done by default that needs to be remediated. And in a system like the US, often what we consider to be the default is the kind of market outcome. Now, I don't mean to suggest that that's a kind of given. The market itself is kind of socially constructed, but you can see where this is all kind of maybe gelling together. What the left wants is to see who's being left out of the current system, the current worldly success, and to do something about that. Well, what about the right? So Kaplan again gives a sort of pithy answer about the right. Rightists are anti-leftist. Now again, that might seem too simple. Surely the right has some kind of political program that isn't just opposition to the left. But look at what Baron de Gaulle says, who was one of the people who was a conservative who, in the original French Parliament, where left and right got named. And how does he describe it? He says, "We began to recognize each other. Those loyal to religion and the king took up positions to the right of the chair, so as to avoid who? The left." So even there, his description, the first-hand account of where the right came from, is that it was those who were opposed to the left. And then again, looking just to Wikipedia, or the right, well, the right, it seems like mostly, in fact, deny that the spectrum is meaningful historically. This is really looking at the history in the French republics. They're saying that it's the left who wants to agree with the spectrum, to say that we're trying to do something, we have a program. What the right is saying is, no, we just want everything that's already cohesive about our society. And Corey Robbins' book, The Reactionary Mind, has a good genealogy of this sort of thing. So what's the kind of cohesive element here? Well, I would say it's that for the right, what they want to see is what's good about the society as it is, and to preserve that. And preserve it against what? Well, those who want change, which is the left. All right. So that's just a descriptive framing, right? It just says the right wants things to stay the same, the left wants change. But surely sometimes things should stay the same, and sometimes things should change. So that doesn't really tell us anything about when the left or the right are kind of being excessive in a kind of moral frame, in the way that we would think of vice as an excess or a deficiency. So when can the right be excessive? Why would someone have an excessive attachment to keeping things the way they are? And here I think Lonergan gives us a pretty clear answer. Group bias. Group spontaneity does not regard all changes in the same cold light of the general good of society. Right? The person who looks at all changes in light of the good of society would never have an excessive attachment to things staying as they are. They would want things to stay as they are if those are good, change them if they're not good, moving on. But it's the people who have a group bias, a blind spot for the insights that reveal the well-being of their own group to be excessive, that therefore don't want change even when change is good. They have an excessive attachment to things staying the same, because to admit that things should change is to admit that the well-being of their own group is excessive. So I want to suggest that in Lonergan's framing, a kind of problematic right-wing position, a failing in the rightward direction, is a product of group bias in the main, because it's precisely the groups who are doing well who don't want things to change. So, okay, so this next part is a little bit trickier maybe. Lonergan seems to think that group bias can sometimes be a feature of the left as well, and I don't doubt that that's true, but I don't think that's the main focus of the left. Why? Well, because people on the left, going back to that original definition, they want change that benefits those who aren't well off. And that's generally true even if they're not part of those groups, right? The whole idea of taking an intersectional frame is that even if you are personally someone with privilege, you recognize those who lack privilege and want to act on their behalf. So group bias isn't a very good fit for that. So where does a kind of excessive attachment to the left come from? I mean, surely you can't have excessive social justice. That's not a question of something you can have too much of. So what's the kind of excess that would lead in that direction? Well, in Joseph Ratzinger's instruction on liberation theology, he identifies what he thinks that excess is. So he says it's not a matter of being too concerned about the problems of human misery and injustice. We can't maintain neutrality for that. We can't be indifferent to that. It's tragic, it's pressing. Instead, what leads us to this excessive leftism is an impatience and a desire for results that, combined with a kind of despair of other methods, leads to Marxist analysis. An intolerable and explosive situation requires effective action, which cannot be put off. So what's excessive is not the desire for justice, but rather the kind of impatience. And the general bias of common sense, Lonergan says, is what causes this. General bias of common sense pushes everything into a practical framing. All right, so what does that look like? So as an example, I'll take this famous quote from Hillary Clinton when she was on the campaign trail about the basket of deplorables. Now, I think she's gotten maybe almost too much flack for this because, first of all, I agree with the first part. I think that many people who are big Trump supporters are in this group. And second of all, she's campaigning, so practicality is a reasonable decision for her. But look at what she actually goes on to say. She says that the people who are in this basket of deplorables are irredeemable, not America. So here there's something that we've been reduced to the practical frame. If they can't be redeemed in this election, then they're irredeemable. And who does she want to sympathize with? Well, precisely those people who are desperate for change. Those who we can appeal to even from a frame of general bias, not the ones in the first group who are clearly subject to group bias. All right, so then where does that take us? What is unprincipled centrism? Well, I would say that it's when general bias infects the right or group bias infects the left. So when does general bias infect the right? Well, I think this is really shown very clearly in this essay, The Flight 93 Election, that was published in the Claremont Review in 2016, basically arguing that we just have to vote for Trump no matter how dangerous because it's the only way out. It's as if we're storming the cockpit against the hijacker who is Obama. And you see why. I mean, so there's this idea of, first of all, an obvious statement of group bias, and then a statement that only a pragmatic result will count, principles don't matter. And so the result of group bias on the first hand, and then a general bias that principles don't count on the second is, do whatever you have to, even if it's, against people's rights and dignity. Well, what about the left? Well, here, again, I think you have a general bias that says, we must do something about inequality. And then you infect that with a group bias that says, well, we shouldn't care about the rich even as human beings. And then we say, bring out the guillotines. I'm not saying this is as present a danger given these people are not necessarily in power or, imminently exercising power, but I do think it's a direction we can see. All right, so to finish up, where does that leave us? So first of all, I think we need to have a kind of an abstract intellectual takeaway, which is that right and left are both prone to excess, but I don't think the biases are parallel. It's not just a matter of a pox on both their houses. They're both doing the same thing, but in opposite directions. Rather, the right is prone to this kind of group bias excess that's closer to a kind of egoism, a kind of lack of moral conversion. But the left is prone to a kind of general bias excess, which is not a matter of moral conversion, but rather a matter of intellectual conversion, to realize that not everything can be fixed in one fell swoop of policy. And therefore, that principled centrism comes from eradicating both group bias and general bias, rather than from trying to counter one with the other. All right, so then I had another example, a kind of concrete example to try to put in here, but I think we're out of time. So I'll leave it there. And if you want to talk about concrete examples of what eradicating that kind of bias would look like, we can talk about that in the questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. Definitely helping open up this topic. Is there questions? from the people? Are there questions? Tim, yeah, you have a question.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for your presentation. My question is, so at the end you concluded that, moral conversion is needed for the right, or they're more apt to need that type of conversion, and intellectual conversion for the left. And maybe this is something that you need to ponder more, that you might not feel like you'd be ready to speak to. But I'm curious what role you think religious conversion might have in the process, or to what extent it can influence these other conversions or be illuminative.
Yeah. Well, I think Lonergan's basic position, and I've been influenced by Fred Lawrence on this, so I'm not actually sure anymore what's Fred's position and what's Lonergan's, but is that, religious conversion fundamentally calls forth the others, right? So if you're going to really live in your religious conversion, then you're going to be drawn towards the other conversions. It doesn't make any sense to say that you love God, but you don't love the people that he created if they're not part of your group. That's just not going to work. Jesus gives us the one new commandment, right? Not really two. And then for intellectual conversion too, to say that you love God is precisely to say that you love someone who is pure spirit, someone you can't see. And so in a way, you can't really do that without intellectual conversion. Without intellectual conversion, you kind of keep moving back to idolatry. Trying to worship something visible, something you can see and interact with. So I think religious conversion is always going to call forward these other kinds of conversion. And I think that generally it's going to call forth moral conversion first, if it's real religious conversion. That's Fred's position, and then intellectual conversion kind of comes next.
Thank you.
Just to throw one other thing on that, so that some recent survey data has shown, for instance, that while people who identify as Christians are more likely to take some of these kind of really extreme, what we might call Trumpian views, that people who actually go to church are less likely to take them than the average American. So, I mean, that's just descriptive data, but I don't think it's irrelevant.
Yeah, interesting.
Damien Prescott, you had a question. Do you still want to ask that question?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of an observation, I guess. Can you hear me, by the way? I've got my headphones on. I'm not sure if it's coming.
Yep, no problem.
Good stuff. So I guess, I've been thinking a lot about this lately within our own context. I'm speaking from the UK. Brexit has been a big issue. There are a lot of assumptions around democracy. For democracy to work, you need an informed electorate voting for the common good. An informed electorate assumes that there's an understanding of very complex issues going against the general bias of common sense. And the common good would potentially mean voting against your own class's interests. And since these are unlikely to happen, do we perhaps need philosopher kings and queens to step into the gap?
Well, I think the problem you have there is that the philosopher king doesn't fundamentally have any other tools available to him either. I mean, how is the philosopher king going to achieve power? By, putting together some violent mob to take over power? I mean, that's just going to lead to the same kinds of problems. So it seems to me that the philosopher king, once you take it out of a thought experiment, doesn't really have any means available to him that he doesn't already have available in what we might call the attempt to make a democracy into what Aristotle would call a republic. In other words, something where people are in fact responding to the common good rather than just their own interests.
No, I hear you. To be honest, it was more of a rhetorical question. I'm railing against my own despair, you know.
Understood. Understood.
Ryan, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and yeah, blessings upon you as you continue these studies and your physics studies. So thank you for being a part of this Lonergan on the Edge.